Most people believe financial disasters strike out of nowhere, like lightning from a clear sky, unpredictable and untamable. But what if the real danger is not chaos, but pattern? What if financial collapse is not lightning, but choreography, a sequence so precise that once you recognize it, the so-called storm almost feels inevitable? History does not whisper this truth. It screams it. And when you place 1929 beside 2008 and then compare both, the parallels are not just striking. They are unmistakable. The same excess, the same arrogance, the same blind faith in institutions already creaking from within. If what is happening now feels normal to you, it is because you have forgotten the lessons of a past most people never fully understood. Stay with me. My name is Marcus Blackwell. I am not a financial advisor, but I study the long arc of financial history. I trace the echoes between centuries, the rhythms that repeat, and the illusions that blind entire populations right before a crash. My mission is simple: to reveal the truth behind the system before it reveals itself in the form of panic and collapse. I am not here to frighten you. I am here to prepare you. Because history may not repeat word for word, but its pattern remains intact. And we are walking straight into a cycle the world has already lived through twice. The public may not see it, but the pattern is unmistakable. To understand where we are now, you must understand where we have been. 1929 was not a sudden accident. It was the finale of a decade built on unchecked speculation, soaring debt, cheap credit, and a public convinced prosperity had become permanent. People believed the stock market would rise forever. Banks loaned money to anyone with a pulse. Corporations inflated their valuations through accounting tricks and reckless expansion. And beneath all that euphoria was a structural weakness that could not sustain the weight placed upon it. When confidence cracked, the foundation collapsed. Here is where the pattern turns dangerous. Fast forward nearly 80 years. 2008 did not emerge from nowhere. It was the delayed echo of 1929. Again, the world drowned itself in debt. Again, credit flowed faster than the economy could absorb. Again, banks created complex financial illusions to hide risk instead of confronting it. Again, people believed housing prices would rise forever, just as they once believed stock prices would rise without limit. History changed its clothing, but the pattern underneath remained the same. And when the cycle snapped, the system convulsed with the same violence it had in 1929. The similarities are no longer subtle. They are glaring, almost mathematical, and they reveal a truth few are willing to acknowledge. We are not entering a new cycle. We are nearing the final stage of a repeating one. The same forces that tore through 1929 and 2008 are building again, only now they are larger, more interconnected, and more global than ever before. The world is not facing a national crisis or a sector-specific meltdown. It is facing a systemic repetition of history on a scale we have never experienced. Each major collapse in modern finance follows three phases. First, a period of euphoria driven by easy money and speculative excess. Second, a period of strain where debt outgrows productivity and the illusion of stability begins to fray. Third, a moment of sudden reversal when trust evaporates and the system that once felt invincible implodes under its own pressure. 1929 followed this rhythm. 2008 followed it as well. We are deep in the second phase and accelerating toward the third. Consider the parallels. In the 1920s, speculation surged because credit was cheap and regulators were asleep at the wheel. In the 2000s, cheap mortgages and financial engineering created an entire economy built on illusions. Central banks kept interest rates at near zero for over a decade, inflating asset prices far beyond their real value. Stocks soared, real estate surged, corporate debt exploded, governments borrowed without restraint, households lived on credit while wages stagnated, and yet the markets continued to climb. This apparent contradiction is not strength, it is late-stage pressure. Notice how trust behaves before every financial collapse. It weakens slowly, then breaks all at once. Before 1929, people sensed instability but dismissed it. Before 2008, skeptics warned the housing market was unsustainable, but the crowd laughed it off. People feel the strain every time they buy groceries, pay bills, or watch debt balances grow faster than income. They sense instability, but they cling to the belief that the system will correct itself. But systems do not correct themselves. They unwind. And they unwind in ways that always surprise the public. Let me show you the deeper pattern that binds 1929, 2008, and now. Every cycle begins with the expansion of credit. Credit fuels growth at first, then dependence, then addiction. When interest rates rise or growth slows, that credit becomes unbearable. In 1929, it was margin debt that snapped. In 2008, it was mortgage debt. It is sovereign debt, corporate debt, consumer debt, and derivatives tied to all three. This is not one sector under strain. This is the entire system strained simultaneously. And here is the part most people misunderstand. Look at how governments behave late in the cycle. They reassure the public. They issue statements. They deny the severity of problems. They create programs that delay the inevitable without addressing the structural weaknesses. We saw it in 1929. We saw it in 2008. We are seeing it again. When governments begin managing perception rather than solving problems, you know the cycle has entered its final phase. Look also at how central banks behave. In 1929, the Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy into a weakening economy, triggering a liquidity shock. In 2008, the Federal Reserve kept rates low for too long, and then raised them into a fragile system, exposing the cracks that had been building for years. Central banks are trapped. If they raise rates, they break the system. If they lower rates, inflation surges again and erodes public trust. This is a no-win scenario, the same corner every late-stage cycle has backed them into. The difference now is scale. The collapse risk is not national, it is global. Here is where the psychological warning becomes chilling. Collapses do not happen because of numbers. They happen because of belief. The belief in ever-rising markets. The belief that inflation will subside. The belief that governments can manage debt without consequence. The belief that central banks can stabilize everything. Belief is the fuel of expansion, but belief is also the trigger of collapse. Once enough people realize the pattern is repeating, they change behavior. They pull back. They withdraw. They sell. They save. They panic. And the system responds with violent speed. Now incorporate another dimension into this global landscape: political and geopolitical tension. In the last few weeks, the United States military executed a bold operation in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and sparking international outcry, geopolitical instability, and renewed pressure on oil markets. The U.S. move has disrupted Venezuela's already fragile economy and poured uncertainty into global energy supplies. Armed militias and armed conflict have increased on the ground while civilians face price hikes and shortages, with everyday life feeling the strain of instability in Caracas. Governments and markets can tolerate economic stress, but political upheaval and military intervention in a major oil-producing nation introduces a new level of structural risk into the global system. And this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. Before the collapse of 1929, insiders began quietly selling assets even as the public continued buying. Before 2008, institutional investors began positioning themselves for volatility months before the crash. Today, we see the same quiet repositioning. Central banks are shifting reserves. Major investors are reducing exposure to risk assets. Corporations are hoarding cash. Banks are tightening credit even while insisting everything is stable. This is not caution. This is preparation. Preparation for a cycle that is no longer stable and cannot return to what it once was. Look deeper into consumer behavior. Before 1929, households believed they were wealthier than they truly were. Before 2008, homeowners believed rising property prices meant permanent prosperity. Consumers believed the stock market's resilience means stability. even while inflation eats their purchasing power and debt grows faster than wages. This psychological disconnect is one of the strongest indicators that the cycle is in its final phase. People feel strain at home but believe the system is fine because markets remain elevated. That illusion is the same misalignment that preceded both previous collapses. Now imagine corporations under this pressure. In 1929, companies overexpanded and were left vulnerable. In 2008, corporations were heavily leveraged. Record corporate debt accumulated during years of cheap credit now faces rising refinancing costs. Companies use cheap money not to build resilience, but to inflate valuations and buy back stock. This structural weakness is not a deviation from the cycle. It is the cycle. The government cycle follows the same trajectory. Before 1929, policymakers reassured the public. Before 2008, leaders insisted markets were healthy. Governments around the world repeat the same narrative. Inflation is transitory, debt is manageable, stability is assured. Words have become a substitute for solutions, even as deficits expand and structural problems deepen. And the monetary cycle reveals the most chilling symmetry of all. The same forces that played out in 1929 and 2008 are unfolding now. Easy credit, elevated asset prices, rising debt, and systemic dependence on cheap money, all signs of a late-stage cycle that never ends well. But here is the key insight. The pattern is not repeating by accident. It is repeating because debts grow faster than economies, because speculation outpaces productivity, because illusions overpower discipline, and because human nature does not change. The same optimism, the same denial, the same misplaced trust. This is the rhythm of collapse. Yet the cycle we live through is not just a replay. It is a supercycle, a web of bubbles spanning stocks, real estate, sovereign debt, corporate credit, consumer finance, technology valuations, and government deficits. When one bubble bleeds, the entire structure shifts. When multiple fails, the cycle breaks. What comes next is predictable not in timing, but in sequence. Before every collapse, instability rises. Prices fluctuate violently. Public sentiment becomes confused. Leaders contradict themselves. Experts disagree. Markets swing as fear and hope battle for dominance. The public senses something is wrong but cannot identify the cause. This moment is not the collapse. It is the final warning. The same warning that appeared before 1929 and 2008, and the same warning appearing now. But understanding the pattern is not the same as fearing it. Those who study cycles are never the ones destroyed by them. Those who understand the rhythm prepare while the rest remain blind. Preparation does not require panic. It requires clarity. And clarity begins with accepting that the system is not malfunctioning. It is completing its pattern. The question becomes not whether the cycle will turn, but how you will position yourself before it does. Before 1929, a small group recognized the excess and protected their assets. Before 2008, a quiet minority saw the housing bubble and insulated themselves. The same opportunity exists for those willing to see the pattern for what it is. Preparing for the next stage means recognizing that debt-driven growth cannot continue indefinitely. It means understanding that asset prices inflated by cheap credit will not hold when credit contracts. It means acknowledging that governments cannot borrow without consequence, and central banks cannot fix structural problems with temporary tools. It means building resilience while the illusion still exists. Here is the truth history gives to those who listen. Every collapse becomes a transfer of wealth. Not disappearance, migration. From leveraged to unleveraged. From overconfident to prepared. From those who followed the crowd to those who studied the pattern. The winners of the next era will not be chosen by fortune. They will be chosen by foresight. Because when you see 1929 in the present, when you hear 2008 echoing in the data, when you recognize the same signals repeating almost perfectly, you stop living in denial and start living in reality. And reality gives you the power to act. If any part of this feels familiar in your own life, if you feel the strain of inflation in your bills, The disconnect between markets and your paycheck, or the tension of global instability? Tell me in the comments what you are noticing and how you are preparing. Patterns become clearer when people compare notes. And remember this, when the next collapse arrives, as collapses always do, the wise prepare quietly, while the unprepared panic loudly for all to see.